Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The New York Times. Famous or infamous? It certainly depends on who you ask. Interestingly enough, though, the Times recently published an opinion piece on the media giant's own rise. And it's entitled, Why the Success of the New York Times May Be Bad for News Journalism. So just how dominant is the Times? Well, according to that opinion piece, the gulf between the Times and the rest of the industry is vast, and it keeps growing. The company now has more digital subscribers than the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the 250 local Gannett papers combined, according to the most recent data. And the Times employs 1,700 journalists, which is a huge number in an industry where total employment nationally has fallen to somewhere between 20,000 and 38,000. To put that in perspective, on the low end, the Times employs around 12% of all news journalists. Or on the high end, it employs about 22% of all news journalists. Can we trust the New York Times? That's what we're looking at today. This conversation's going to look at not just the New York Times, but news media consumption as a whole. In the age of the coronavirus, where we get our information and who we trust is of the utmost importance. But of course, we can't begin this critical conversation on the news media and all things honesty without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, it's an interesting take on the Times and what's happened to it in the last 6 or 7 years, because they were selling furniture and everybody was wondering if it was when to buy the last copy. And now it's grown into this mega giant in the news media, and it's an interesting twist of fate. So looking forward to discussing this today.
So it was back in 2014, Lance, when digital media was on the rise. And as you highlighted, people were kind of, wondering about the dying legacy of outlets like the New York Times. The stock itself, the New York Times stock, was in a bad way back in 2014. And I've shared with you before, I think that, kind of not exactly on a whim, but leading up to the 2016 election in 2015, when TrueChat was covering everything, I decided to purchase some stock in the Times, not really because of any reason other than that I was, at the time, a daily subscriber to the print edition of the Times, along with the Wall Street Journal. And that's part of what we want to mention here at the onset of the program that I think is important, right, Lance, for our listeners to remember, is that as it stands, we review the Wall Street Journal Monday through Saturday. We also get the Sunday edition of the Times. We have digital access to both news outlets, and we also consume National Geographic. I think we hit all the publications there that we consume on a regular basis, Lance, right?
If you don't count the Urbana Daily Citizen.
Oh, yes. Oh, I knew we were missing one. The Urbana Daily Citizen, which is our local newspaper here in Urbana, Ohio.
We'll plug that because,
and if you want to know what's going on,
small media, small newspapers are dying. We did a show, a year ago, 18 months ago, about how small newspapers around America are dying, and with it dying a real integral part of how people gather their news. And so a little plug there for our local newspaper.
Yes. So those are all the places that we pay to get news from. We're not going to count any of the cable news outlets that we watch or any of the free online sources, because we don't pay for those. I mean, we don't pay for them directly. We might pay through, like a TV subscription or something, but we don't actually pay money directly to those outlets for their information. Why should our listeners care, Lance, that we have access to these different venues and these different sources of information?
Well, hopefully it lets them know that we aren't just spitting out what one place or one person has to say, that we're trying to give all different sides of an issue a look and see what different people are saying or different outlets are saying about the same topic. And then also that those are very well-intentioned national publications that can give us content on a large number of different issues.
To reiterate, when we talk about those other publications, they've become dwarfed by the Times. And this has really been pretty fast. I mean, we're talking about just the last 2 years or so that the Times has overtaken, and now combined, outweighs the competition in regards to their total subscriber count. The focus of today's episode is whether or not that's really a good thing or not. Because, regardless of what you think of the New York Times, and I think this is the other point that we want to make early on here, Lance, regardless of whether or not you read it, whether or not you trust it, we have to be really aware in the times we live in, especially right now. We have to be super alert to what we're consuming, because I can't tell you, Lance, I almost just avoid going on social media right now because there is so much misinformation out there. There's
so much more news, in air quotes, available today than when I was growing up or when I was a young man your age. We were pretty much limited to some weekly news magazines, a few monthly magazines, the evening news, which you had a half hour of local news and a half hour of national news. And we were all in a given area pretty much sitting down and reading the same things and hearing the same things and watching the same things. That's totally changed. So yes, it has changed on how it's consumed, but the amount of it is staggering to my mind, being a little older. And a little bit about the Times too. I've read this in other places, not the New York Times, but other places give President Trump credit for the rise of the Times, which is interesting when the president is very vehement in his current dislike of the Times and how it's not a part of the White House and they don't pay for a subscription anymore. But because of his presidency has kind of coincided with the rise of the Times as well. So it's interesting when you look at that scenario.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked to you a little bit about that as well. And I think that's important for people to understand how much of it's true. Obviously, I don't think that there's anybody that can provide us a definitive answer on that because it's very difficult to measure. I talk a lot about, right? We learned in psychology classes, correlation does not necessarily equal causation, right? And you can learn that a lot of places, but they were big on that because we would look at lots of mental health studies that are being done. And it would be very easy to say, well, we got this result, so therefore this must be true. And that therefore leap is something that we do all over in society, not just the news media, but we do that in all manner of places where sometimes that leap is not an appropriate or justified next step. It might be, there might not necessarily be factual information to back it up. And I think that that's part of that argument with the president is it looks like, the more the president is critical of the New York Times, the bigger the Times grows. And in turn, you could, extend the argument even further and say, therefore, the Times, increases its coverage of the president because it is rewarded by the president's continued criticism in more subscribers that it gets. So we have this kind of endless cycle here of, the president critiques the Times gets more subscribers, it covers the president more, which leads to further critique, and on we go. But that could be said of probably arguably any outlet. I think the Times is just an interesting example because it's really been it's done a 180 here from a downward trajectory to not only an upward trajectory, but dominating what we think of as and I'm saying this with air quotes, print news industry, because yes, they still print a paper. but they're obviously different than an outlet like CNN, Fox News, etc.
Well, and there are so many apps that provide the news, and you have, shown me 3 or 4 of those that, you have access to individually. We don't use it at True Chat, but how you consume your news many times is different than how I do it. And that's part of our age difference as well. Plus, the Times was smart at a time when I remember all these online outlets were coming into play. Axios is one that I can think of off the top of my head, and you'll have to help me. But there were many of them, and the Times said, if BuzzFeed, there's another big one. If we are going to grow with the age of media, we need to get in that as well. So even though they invested in their reporters so that they could still produce the kind of stories that they were used to doing, they began to branch out in some of these growing ways that people consume the news. So that too, I think, has had a major effect on the success of the Times.
Absolutely. And we talked a little bit too about the difference between how boomers and millennials consume the news. It's interesting because really millennials are seeking out this, these written versions of the news, these quote unquote print articles, even though they're being delivered in a digital manner. And I think a big part of that is they see the gross conduct at times of people on cable news and the inflammatory way that some of those discussions go. And they get so much of that online anyway. The quote unquote print industry offers a slightly more calm version to look at. So what we're going to discuss coming up is whether or not the rise of the Times is a good or bad thing for the news media. In fact, the news media has some perspectives on this, both supportive and critical of the Times, as well as Lance and I's perspective on the rise of the Times. To find out whether or not you can trust the New York Times, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
According to a piece in the New York Times, the company now has more digital subscribers than the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the 250 local Gannett papers combined, according to the most recent data. And the Times employs 1,700 journalists, which is a huge number, upwards of 22%, possibly, of the entire news journalist industry. Can we trust this media giant? Well, the news media itself has some different points here, some different things to take into consideration. The founder of Axios, which Lance mentioned in the first segment, says, quote, "The New York Times is going to basically be a monopoly. The Times will get bigger and the niche will get nichier and nothing else will survive." The author, Ben Smith, of this piece entitled "Why the Success of the New York Times May Be Bad for News Journalism," which if you'd like to read, you can go to thestateofus.org and find it linked there, says the consolidation of everything from movies to news as the media industry gets hollowed out by the same rich get richer, winner take all forces that have reshaped business from airlines to pharmaceuticals. He claims that the story of consolidation in media is a story about the New York Times itself. On the flip side, though, Lance, you've got some other people, like the editor of the Boston Globe, who believe that what is happening with the Times is a model for the rest of the news industry, an opportunity for them to save themselves by copying or reinventing the success of the Times. But this one stuck out to me in particular. The former U.S. Weekly editor, who has now reinvented the Hollywood Reporter, says, quote, "Because we're talking about the publishing business, it's all still kind of sad. But in this parallel universe, people talk about the New York Times in the way people in Hollywood talk about Netflix. It's the tale that wags the dog. And it's also the dog.
And the reality is probably somewhere in between all of that is how it's really how it's really shaping up and how it will shake out. Because if my extended years on this planet has proven anything to me or shown me anything, that is whatever we think the new normal is will change. It may not change as quickly as we want. It may not change in the way that we want. But I think what everybody was describing is the situation as it is currently. I would not anticipate it to stay this way. Things will happen, sometimes within the control of individuals or nations, sometimes not. And I'm not sure that, the Times will become that big, bad, ugly monopoly, as Axios said. Nor do I think it's that Netflix will continue to run everything as they say in Hollywood, because since the rise of Netflix, there are many other independent outlets like that are going after the talent and producing shows. And, my television is full of apps that I can purchase with all kinds of different shows. So while one maybe is the top, I don't think it's going to take away that competition and somebody coming up with something new or different or a star show or a star personality that just kind of takes over, and then they'll become the new Netflix, the new Times. So I think this is just the direction we're going. I don't see the Times as being doomsday taking over and everybody else loses out.
Something I pointed out to you, Lance, before the show that I think is important to mention for other people too is understanding that a lot of these critics, with the exception of Axios, but even the people that work at Axios, and this isn't a dig at them just for what it's worth, I think it's great that there are startups like Axios out there who are trying to do something different, who are bringing old media journalists into the new media format and who are going independent. But a lot of these people that are being critical of the Times are from the conglomerate news media outlets. The Gimlet Medias of the world, the Disneys of the world that own, respectively, a quarter or more of each of their industries. So you also have to take that into account, that some of that is just animosity for the Times because they didn't do what the Times is doing. They're not experiencing the same success. And of course, the Times, the publisher of the Times, of course, frames it as, that he thinks it's good for the whole business because, it's that rising tide lifts all sails type of thing, or lifts all boats, excuse me. And that's actually what he said in his quote. He doesn't think it's a winner take all dynamic because part of what they're seeing is that people usually subscribe to more than one source. In other words, if you're likely to be somebody who would subscribe to the Times, you're probably also going to pay for another subscription. Now, you might be the type of person that won't pay for news anywhere ever under any circumstances, but that's not who the Times is talking about. Because they're not in the game for anybody. So when they look at who's available, the Times argument, of course, is that, what we're doing is we employ the largest newsroom, in the world. And that is good for everybody because the more journalists we have out there, the more availability of information. And that's actually some of what we'll look at in the third segment. But before we get there, Lance, I want to ask you, because the whole point of this section is, can we trust the Times? Do you trust the Times, Lance?
I mean, personally, yes, I do. I think that it's an interesting scenario and time that we live in when it's become, even in the media, so politicized. But it's interesting that when you read the Times, you can get both sides of things. Maybe not as much as some of the conservatives would want, but when you read it weekly like we do, or get online and read it daily, there are many different takes, which is what's encouraging when you have 1,700 reporters in that you can put people out there on different sides of an issue who come up with a story, and then you can print all of it and over time get to see what the different points are that everybody's trying to make. Plus, the other thing here is with them employing so many reporters, then it still makes people out there want to work at this craft, which then gives us even more reporters, people working in smaller areas, smaller newspapers, smaller news outlets that are honing their craft that one day maybe want to write for the Time, which then it's kind of that rising water scenario. The more people you have doing the job, the more people you will have breaking the stories and giving us the truth and holding the bigger news outlets, holding their feet to the fire. In all due transparency, I enjoy Axios. So even though I disagree with what their founder said as far as the power of the Times, I do enjoy what they do and enjoy reading some of their work. But I guess overall, you have to trust the Times. It's more of an overarching, and not to get into our third segment too much, but for me, the real concern is how we have part of the country trusting one set of news outlets and another one trusting a different set of news outlets. And while historically that's not unprecedented, that's unprecedented in my lifetime.
We've had a lot of episodes where, Lance has talked to, I think, myself and some of our listeners who are not as advanced in years as Lance and others are about, when we encounter certain situations, maybe we haven't been in that exact situation before, but we've been in something similar. And I think that's part of what Lance is talking about is, a lot of people don't recall, or maybe they never knew, but the quote news was born out of opinion papers. If you look back at most of the early newspapers in this country, they were very opinionated. There was very little, there wasn't, a lot of times there wasn't even an attempt at being objective. They didn't look at that as that was their job.
Well, in the epicenter, ironically enough, during the American Revolution was New York City, where what you just got done describing, that was the center of where all of that was taking place.
Right. We're going to pull in the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about news diversification and whether or not that's a good thing, because that's part of what we just hinted at here is there such a thing as too many sources of information? Can that actually be a detriment? And the answer might seem rhetorical to you, but you've got to stick around because you might be surprised with the differing opinions you're going to hear in the third segment. We're going to pull in our producer, Bradley Butch, for the third segment too, and learn a little bit about Gen Z's perspective on, quote, the news. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The company that controls or employs, depending on your perspective, anywhere from 12% to 22% of all news journalists, yes, we're talking about the New York Times, actually has, to its credit, ironically, possibly two notable groups to thank. First, it has millennials to thank, which is ironic when you think about it, because millennials, depending on who you ask, may be partly responsible for the death of the news or of the print media industry. But on the flip side, they're the ones heavily subscribing to the New York Times digitally. So they're also to thank for the revitalization of all of that. The other group, or rather person, might be the president, which we talked about a little bit in the last segment. Although what I'm interested in talking about here and posing real quickly is this idea of news diversification, because Lance and I talked some in the first segment about boomers and millennials and their difference in news consumption preference. It is no secret that I am not a fan of cable news media. And yes, I mean it collectively. I'm talking about MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and the like. I am not a big fan of any of them. And I know that for some of our boomers out there, I'm sure Lance included in them, who enjoy watching cable news, who might find it entertaining, that could be inflammatory or somewhat confrontational, that I'm not a big fan of them, because I think they're all rather poisonous in the way that they present the quote unquote news to their audiences, and for lack of a better phrase, the simple way that they distort and intertwine opinions so heavily in what they present as news. And just to be clear, I don't view that as hypocritical, because I don't think the State of Us pretends to be a news program. I don't think that's what we are, and it's not what we aim to be. We are here, open and honest, to provide you with our opinions and to have a conversation. And we, I think, make that plain in every episode that we do, or we try to at least, when we tell you about our mission statement. And we link the articles that we're referencing so that if you want to read the news that we're reading, you can read it. But I want to turn real quick here before we go back to Lance to Bradley, our producer in the control booth here, because one of the things that has been fascinating to me as we've gotten to start to work with some members of Gen Z, for those of you that don't recall, they're the ones following the millennials. They're the generation right behind my generation. How the way they consume news is just so different, for the most part. And again, this is stereotyping and it's on the whole, so, take it lightly. But when you learn things, Bradley, right? When you're learning about what's going on in the world, how do you typically find out about something?
Well, I think I'm kind of in a unique situation because I find out most of my news from working here.
Oh, okay. Well, aside from that, let's rewind to before you worked here then.
You're not going to like this answer, but probably Twitter.
Yep.
It's not about liking. It's not about liking or disliking. It's just what's the truth. So
yeah,
it is what it is.
Never would do any cable news. I never read the newspaper before I worked here. So it was Twitter, Instagram.
But let's be specific though about those, because this is something that people say a lot. And I'm sure, Lance, you've heard some of your students say this before. I get my news from Twitter, or I get my news from Facebook or social media or Instagram or whatever. But really those outlets don't actually produce quote unquote news. They distribute information from news providers. So you're on Twitter and you see a tweet about something. Who is that coming from?
It's coming from somebody who read the article and now they're discussing it on Twitter.
Okay. So you're not following,
I'm just seeing the discussion on social media.
Right. So somebody tweets something, but it's not from the source directly. So it could be, for example, a discussion on a New York Times article or on an article from Fox News, right? And you're reading the back and forth, and that's how you're surmising what's happening.
So people's opinions served as your source of, air quotes, the word news, because that became the news, is what you read of their opinions on the article. So it was almost, in a sense, third person, because you didn't see the actual article. But it's not anything to apologize for per se, because there's a very distinct segment of our population in the United States and around the world who gets their news in just that fashion. And I think that's part of my point. And it's like Justin was teasing me before the show about being a boomer and watching cable news, but I watch it with a discerning eye, because I don't watch it for news content. I watch it because the thing that Justin hates is they don't give the news, but they'll have a panel discuss something. And there are certain panelists that I want to hear, or I'll flip back and forth and say, this channel's panelist took this story and said this. This station's panelist took the same story and had a different outcome. And then I go and find the story and read 3 or 4 articles on that myself, and then try to figure out where I am on the issue. Now, I know most people don't have that kind of time or desire to do that. But so I think I kind of consume cable news differently than many people in my generation.
I think there's a lot of people, especially we'll say listeners of the State of Us, because, I tend to feel that our audience, Lance, is probably a little more discerning than maybe the rest of the population, or they wouldn't be listening to this program, because that's, we live in that area of nuance, or at least we try to. I think we try to be really transparent with people. If you've listened to the show long enough, you probably know that I really struggle with, and Lance knows this because we've had these conversations, with the objectivity of the State of Us, and our own ability to live up to what we're saying. Because I think it would be easy for people of certain ideological backgrounds to tune in and dislike our program. Because the reality is that when you try to do what we do and consider different sides of something and talk in non-inflammatory statements, and again, I'm really not trying to pass judgment there. I know it might sound condescending or whatever, but that's not the point. You tend to fall more near the middle than you do to either of the extremes.
You go back to William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and the whole age of yellow journalism, where Hearst very famously sent a reporter to Cuba, and the guy said, yeah, there's not much going on here. And Hearst said, well, you furnish me the picture and I'll furnish the war. You take pictures of two guys beating each other up outside of a bar, and I'll write a story that makes it sound like the United States and Spain are going to go to war over Cuba. So yeah, that is the history of print as we entered the 20th century. The whole, and we even give it a name, yellow journalism. And then you have, the Edward R. Murrows of the world and Walter Cronkites and, World War II, and we're going to report and embed reporters and give real news. And so it's a genre that has constantly changed throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just important to understand. We talk about a lot, and I've had the conversations with Bradley about why should you care about history? I've talked to my fiance some about that as well, because I think that there's a distaste, Lance, from a lot of people for history because they don't see its practical relevance to what we're going through. But so often it offers us a lens from which to understand that many people have been in this situation before and grappled with many of the same ideological things that we're talking about now. And so I think my distaste, Lance, for cable news comes from the lack of clear boundaries and lines that are established. There is no attempt to communicate what we're trying to accomplish with our programming. They assume that it's all just implied, and that everybody, or they don't assume that it's implied, and they just want everybody to come up with whatever they think it is.
But that doesn't get viewers, and it doesn't therefore doesn't sell to advertisers. I'm remembering when Ted Turner started CNN, it was basically on the premise that we as a country were so busy that we couldn't all sit down at 6 o'clock and watch the evening news, watch the local news from 6 to 6:30 and the evening news, national news from 6:30 to 7. So he said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play that hour of news 24 hours a day. And that was the concept of 24-hour cable news network. Unfortunately, people said, now we can make money off of it. So if we take sides and we have these panels and we make incendiary remarks, we can now get viewers over someone else. And then we can go to the advertisers and say, look how many viewers we have. And so now we have a situation where people are making money off the news, and they've gone away from just reporting the news, and it's become hour-long news dramas where there's a hint of fact, but we're going to create a show that is entertaining so that we can make money off of it.
And I think part of what's difficult, and this is what, True Chat's been around, I think, let's see, this is 2020. So we're going on, this is our 9th year, I think. Almost since the almost since the inception, Lance. I mean, I know you witnessed it. Our mission statement has been refined several times to try to better articulate what we're after. Because, I've always asserted that the truth is, in the eyes of the beholder. And I think that that's part of the problem is, we're asking people to do the news. And as long as we do that, we all have to accept that we're never going to get the whole picture. We just can't. And it's not out of it's not malicious intent here. It's that we all have to make decisions. If I have a word limit, I have to make decisions about what goes in and what stays out. I can't include it all. And I might not even know it all, so there's all these problems that come into play. But what we have to seek to do, at least from my perspective, is we have to have that desire, like Lance has communicated, to make the time. I'm busy. Lance is busy. Bradley's busy. We're all freaking busy, people. I don't know if that's occurred to anybody else or not, but you're not special. You're not the only person on planet Earth that's busy. And if you care about being informed, you'll make the time to be informed. And if you don't, you won't. And that's okay. If you don't want to be informed, life can be easier that way. Honestly, the more you know, the more painful it can be to not get involved. So I'm not passing judgment on the people who make that decision to try to stay out of that fray. But if you're going to be in the fray, then be in it and put in the time to at least take into consideration the multiple sources of information. Speaking of that, Lance, seems like a perfect time to tell people about what we're trying to accomplish here across True Chat and specifically on the State of Us with our mission statement.
Well, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
Questioning, right? Some back and forth, some dialogue. Okay. Respectful. What a notion.
Being honest and maybe not saying what everybody wants to hear, or maybe not even saying what each other wants to hear, but at least being honest in the way in sharing how we feel about something and where we're coming from and what's our information that we're using to make that decision.
And the way that this process expands and the way that we help more people, that we educate more people, is if our existing listeners, those of you out there committed to this principle that we are committed to, if they invite others, right, to be part of this, because this is a radio show on the weekends, but you can get the newest episodes as a podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So what are some of the ways that our listeners could invite others to tune in to the podcast?
Well, and that's the key. If we don't get more people listening, then we will all of us who are a part of this never, and our listeners are included, change things the way we'd like to see them change. And that is to have people having open and honest discussions. But you can get us through Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, for contributing to today's conversation and, as always, making sure that we sound pretty darn good. Thank you all for making this possible. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.